Hello, everyone. Those who want to listen to this very exciting panel today on resilient cities, if you could have a seat, please. Take your headphones. That's how you will hear better because there's a lot of background noise. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. We apologize to start it a little bit later as we waited some people to come to our pavilion. So my name is Julia Polycarp and I will be moderating this session today. I'm the climate change specialist at AIB and very excited to welcome everybody to speak on adaptation and specifically on how we can build resilience in a more systematic way in cities. So we'll start with an opening remarks in a scene setting by DG, Director General of the CDRI, Dr. Promit Amit, and we'll proceed with a panel discussion followed by a Q&A from the speakers. So if I may ask DG to please come over and give us some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julija, for having me, and thank you for AIB for organizing this session, which is, as we think about cities, we're actually living in the century of cities. This is pretty much being referred to as the urban century. And I can see around the room, I don't need to tell you why cities are important. All of you bring that expertise. When you're starting to give keynote or set the stage for such an audience, such a panel, esteemed panel, it's always hard to say, what do I point to? The points I would like you to think about really, and if you can bring them out in your discussions, are that we are dealing with cities not as a homogeneous entity, but we're dealing with cities in all of their variety of contexts. So when you're thinking about infrastructure, you're thinking of infrastructure for the formal city and the informal city. You're thinking about infrastructure, you're thinking about infrastructure on the coast or in the mountains. You're thinking about challenges, you're thinking about extreme heat in some parts of the world, you're thinking about flooding in other parts of the world, yet there are still earthquakes and landslides and risks that are compounding around the world. They may or may not be climate change related, but a lot of it is climate related. How do we, in the space of infrastructure investments in urban contexts, really push the agenda? We've seen, I just came from a panel where somebody was talking about, there was a practice of building transportation systems along rivers, and now suddenly rivers, when they flood, the transportation system gets impacted. Now that solution of the 1960s, 70s, 80s may not be the solution for the 2030, 2040, 2050. So how do we think differently? How do we invest differently? How do we really put in that understanding of increased risk? Some of it is climate change related, some of it is just bad urban design, bad urban planning. So these are all compounding risks. When you have heavy precipitation, when you have warmer climate, you really have to get past the point of, I need to put a road the way I've done it, I need to build a storm drain the way I've done it, I need to put my housing and build my housing the way I've done it in the past. It's really about how do we think differently. I'm just looking at the panelists, all of you are experts. I'm really curious to see how you can push us on innovation. I think we really, really, really need to innovate. So if we can spur some thinking around how do you innovate for this century? We need to discuss capacity. We're dealing with parts of the world where urbanization is happening at such a pace, but you don't have capacity to manage it. So how do the MDB world, the think tank world, how do we push that capacity? And the third part is governance. Cities are incredibly complex entities. How do we ensure that the governance systems that are being put in place can manage the risks of yesterday, today, and tomorrow? I'll just, in 1 minute, explain who I am. I lead the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We are pretty much the newest international entity around, but our focus is really to become a center of excellence working with partners who are investing. We are not investing. We are really trying to support capacity building, bring in data, get expertise from coalition members. We've got 40 countries who are members, 7 international organizations who are members. We're really trying to think very hard to see how do we get the expertise. If Brazil faces a flood and wants to reconstruct, how do we quickly mobilize expertise from Australia, India, US, Netherlands, etc. So we're really trying to see how do we bring collective thinking to these problems that are again and again getting repeated around the world. So think of us as a partner from that point of view. We've also very recently launched an urban program to support cities to think about 2 risks, extreme heat and urban flooding, but for infrastructure providers. How does your utility now make a decision on where do I allocate my power when there's a peak demand because of extreme heat? How do they make those decisions? So I'm very happy to talk more about it, but we've got a fantastic lineup, so I really want to listen to all of you. Innovation, capacity, and governance. If you can touch upon that, that'll be excellent. Back to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Proti. Thank you for the very good scene setting. I think those are the indeed key questions to ask when we think about the cities and the complexities around how to address the resilience of cities. So may I kindly invite the panelists to sit down here. We will introduce each one of you, and then we'll start with questions. Thank you. Welcome everyone again. We have a very interesting panel and I'm very excited. No space for me to sit there, so I'll ask my questions from the podium with the ideas that CDRI has expressed through looking at the lenses of the complexities around urban resilience. We have an interesting panel comprised of private sector, the FIs, as well as other international organizations. So I'll start with Veronica Scotti, who is the chairman of the Public Sector Solutions of Swiss Re. Next to Veronica, we have Annika Ben Maïd, and she is the deputy head of the Climate and Nature Division in the French Development Agency. Welcome. Bharat Pandey, the partner and director, Climate and Sustainability of the Boston Consulting Group. Eddie Elias Vasquez, Senior Advisor to the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation. Welcome. And last but not least, the EBRD representative here, Gian Piero Nacci, who is the Director for Sustainability and Infrastructure in EBRD. Welcome everybody again. So I have first question to Veronica. We'll start with you. Starting from this side of the panel and going around. So I think one of the complexities around cities and resilience and how we can help cities to actually support the decision-making process is the issues around data availability and the lack of access to comprehensive data on the different climate hazards and what can be the future projections. How can you help cities and governments to address this specific challenge? Maybe you could speak a little bit to what Swiss Re is doing in this regard with regards to data access and availability.
Thank you so much, Julia. And let me start by saying I'm really delighted to be sharing this panel and the 3 anchoring elements of innovation, capacity, and governance. So I'll try to weave it through my answer. You'll tell me, Mr. Proti, if I go in the right direction. As you know, Swiss Re is a reinsurance company, so our bread and butter business is actually risk management. And we are very principally aligned with risk management because we deploy capital around the world. And so we better be sure that wherever we put our money and our shareholders' money, that we have as a good understanding of the risks as we can make it. So as Julia said, one of the key activities through which we try to, or deliverables, if you will, that we try to offer our city partners and in general public sector counterparts is as long and comprehensive view of climate risk as we can make it available, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, none of us does. But we have developed tools for our own risk assessment that are now available to many counterparts, and these include, projections all the way to the end of this century around any number of climate losses and scenarios. So we today model 190 different risk drivers, many of which are climate related. We have 50 climate scientists that are dedicated to various types of risks and shocks, and we have over 200 terabytes of data that is utilized to feed into this analysis. Historically, these are models that we've developed ourselves. Going forward, we're also integrating ever more the insights and the knowledge of others. And all of this is being developed and delivered to city counterparts through platforms. So whether it's through insurance companies, we have 15,000 insurance users, but ever more we have municipalities using this information, governments, corporates, aligning around key principles of what our climate scenarios look like today, 5 years from now, up to 35 years from now, so to the end of the century. It's IPCC-aligned scenarios, using a stochastic view of any and all type of risks that you can imagine, Julia. And then more recently, we're overlaying engineering data to be able to say, if we were to model these losses with engineered interventions, with or without, what would the risk reduction look like? And I think this is a truly transformative level of insight, because with that you can really plan adaptation with confidence that you're going to get the return on the investment that is required. I'll maybe offer a couple of thoughts very quickly on how this has been used in the interfacing with cities. This kind of approach has enabled us to bring to market the first cover, for instance, for inner vulnerable communities in New York last year. This year I'm really delighted. We're using artificial intelligence for the first cover in California for the city of Fremont, where we're using data, local data level and artificial intelligent projections on flooding, of urban flooding, to be able to help with preparedness. With ICLEI, we're supporting 10 municipalities in Latin America, very different, for the city planning. We've already deployed our knowledge with the mutuals of councils in Australia. They use it for standard setting and land use. So these are just some examples in the last 2 years of how these insights can empower policy, which is governance, capacity building. I shall actually mention our partnership with AIIB, because you're also using this type of insights to help fund for your loans that go towards infrastructure all around the world, to make sure that that is done with a sustainable lens, including climate resilience. So I think we are helping with the mobilization of the funds, with the government side, and of course with plenty of innovation, because we need to integrate the insights of many partners from the tech world to be able to do ever more predictive and responsive designs in the way we also cover our insurance, develop our insurance covers.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Indeed, you've touched upon all of the three elements suggested that we cover: the governance, innovation, and capacity building. And I'm very excited to hear that indeed the opportunities with AI are endless, and the fact that you've also considered that in your tools is really a great example. And also the fact that there are municipalities that are using your platforms and tools, and I hope that there will be more and more of them coming on board and using the latest data on the science side to understand how to actually design different engineering measures. So on to Annika. Maybe you could speak to what AFD, as the bilateral development agency, is doing in the space of resilience, and any of the three elements that you want to highlight in terms of innovation, capacity building, or governance that you are supporting with the financing from your organization.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. So first, I'll start by what we're doing in adaptation and how it has become really strategic for AFD to invest more and to put adaptation high in the agenda of our climate response. And then maybe focusing on what we're doing on urban development. So AFD in 2023 has deployed 40% of its climate finance for adaptation, which is amounting to 3 billion euro in 2023. And we are really proud of this result of having 40% of our climate finance, which is not that usual for all IFIs. Do you think the microphone is working well?
Yes,
because,
yes,
okay,
we hear you
great.
well, yeah.
So let me remove that. So 40% of our financing. And how did we reach that? We mainly reached that because we have a new approach that says that every single project has to be screened for resilience. We have developed a tool called climate screening, and this tool is obligatory for every single project before the identification committee, which is the first committee. In this tool allows the teams, even the ones that are not specialized in climate, to have an idea on the areas or the risks that the project is exposed to, and to force them during the appraisal to ask questions on are we going to respond to these risks, if the risks are high, for instance. If we are in cities, in coastal cities, and I'll come to that, that's something that has to be integrated in the design. And the fact that it is really early in the process of the appraisal of the project, it allows to integrate that within the feasibility study, within the designs of the projects. So that's something that we have now mainstreamed for every single project, and it helps for mainstreaming adaptation within the expert teams, because we have technical experts, sectoral experts that are not totally sometimes familiar with adaptation. So it's really important to give them user-friendly tool. It's really easy to use, and we are trying also to give that to our partners. Maybe also the way we are trying to promote the integration of adaptation is represented by the 3 pillars of a facility called Adaptation, which is a facility that is here in a few African countries to try to promote a better integration of adaptation. And through this facility, we have 3 pillars that will resonate with what you just described. The first one is understanding, second one, planning and invest. Understanding, because we believe that there is still much to do, and you were talking about the modelization, the modeling, and the data to be gathered. So in the countries where we are working with think tanks, with research centers to try to improve the knowledge of the risks that we are exposed to and the vulnerabilities also. Planning, we are supporting a few countries in their development, in the development of national adaptation plan, but not only, because it shouldn't be only a national adaptation plan. It could be in sectoral strategies where we helped support our partners to integrate resilience components. And the last one is invest, because in some areas it's not only policy, it's also, and the policy dialogue could be in the planning side, it's also investing. So we are financing feasibility studies for the priority projects of our partners. It's an approach, adaptation is actually built on a locally led adaptation principle. And we have been the first DFI to join these principles, and we are really proud of that. And I'm mentioning that because when we are talking about urban development, as we are talking today, it's a way to promote also a territorial approach. And that's something that is really important in adaptation to take into consideration. So this locally led adaptation approach is something that we have actually implemented in the adaptation facility, and that now is mainstreamed through all our operation as much as possible. To come to the specificity of adaptation in cities, so to let you know a little bit of AFD and cities in general, it represents 1 billion euro, almost 1 billion euros of financing last year out of 12 billion euros. AFD has historically been involved with city either through central government or directly, because we can actually offer direct financing to local collectivities, to cities, to regions, if their status allows for it. And that's something that we are proud of because it allows to work together on their planning, on their strategic investments. And maybe another facility that I'm going to quote here is Ciclia. It's a facility that we're having with the European Union that is actually dedicated to integrate climate within the cities. It's only for the cities. So it's something that can be used easily by the teams, by our partners, to finance either feasibility study, but also if they need help in designing policies or their local planning. Another partnership that I wanted to mention, and it's not only for cities, it's more globally, but because we have the GCA with us today, we are really happy of our partnership that we're having in a few countries. It allows to work together on feasibility studies and making projects a reality. Maybe another thing that I wanted to mention on adaptation in cities, I wanted to refer to the Ocean Summit that will take place in France in June 2025 in Nice, in the south of France. As part of this summit, or along this summit, the city of Nice has decided to organize a dedicated summit on adaptation of coastal cities. And we are really happy of that. We're trying to contribute as much as possible, and we hope that all the community that is here today and interested in the resilience in the coastal cities will be able to contribute. If we focus on that aspect, I wanted also to mention a tool that we are having, and we are working more and more on adaptation, and that will refer to Swiss Re kind of business. We consider a continuum between adaptation, reduction of risk of catastrophe, and loss and damage. So it shouldn't be from our perspective, it shouldn't be seen separately, but as a whole continuum and a mosaic of instruments that we have to mobilize in response to the impact of climate change. And in this setup, we are working with IDF, Insurance Development Forum, on the development of insurance schemes that would allow to have a public sharing of risks on top of the insurances, private insurance that could be mobilized. And in that regard, as they are innovative tools that we are mobilizing, we are actually, as part of this partnership, working with a lot of private insurers to benefit from your expertise in order to display this tool as part of the mosaic of solutions to the resilience of local cities. Not only local cities, but it could be applied to local cities and the adaptation of coastal cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Attica. This is indeed a mosaic of instruments, like you said, that the AFD is deploying, and great to hear the impact you're doing, which I think also is resulting through the financing that you do in adaptation. And as you said, you're one of the few DFIs that has invested significantly in adaptation, including in the city, so very, very great to hear. Moving on to Barad, as a consulting company, a very well-known consulting company, you are supporting governments in providing advice on building resilience. And maybe what, from your point of view, as you speak to the different developing countries through your support, what are some of the policies that you think are constraints and that need to be actually changed to bring in more capital, more investments in the cities? If you could share some insights on this, thank you.
Thanks, Julia. You're able to hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. No, firstly, thank you for having us here. And I feel I'm standing on the shoulder of giants with so many fantastic co-panelists who do adaptation for a living, plus Amit and yourself. And Amit and I go back a long way, having worked together on similar topics long time back. And Julia, you and us worked together last year as well. So it's great to be here. I think I'll just build a little bit on what my previous panelists spoke. And firstly, just to say, we've had the privilege of working both with private sector and public sector clients on adaptation and resilience solutions over the last 3 or 4 years. We have a dedicated team within BCG that focuses on adaptation resilience and working with different types of clients. And I think for us, the big learning has been that, while a lot of the conversation is at the national level, rubber hits the road at a subnational level and the city level, right? It gets local very quickly. And so if you really want to have an impact, that's the right unit in which you have to engage. So while we do work on national adaptation plans of countries, I think we are very keen to push the discussion from just plans to action. And I think in that journey, we follow sort of a 4-step process. And we worked recently with a very large mega city in Africa and a region in Philippines on this. So I thought I'll just share that with you. The first step is, I think, this whole thing, you were mentioning, Veronica, like starting with really strong analytics, science-based analytics on the vulnerability of the city, right? And I think there are 3 things we've seen can happen which are quite valuable. The first, of course, is you can identify the exact hotspots in the city which are particularly vulnerable in different ways. So you can get a much more granular sense of what the vulnerability is, where the interventions need to be prioritized. The second, which we found very useful, is to calculate the cost of inaction, which is really what's the aggregate cost of inaction for the city if we don't do anything. In the case of the mega city in Africa, we estimated the cost to be about $30 to $40 billion in 2030, which is 14 times their national budget. So just bringing an order of magnitude sense of what's the vulnerability, helps shake up and wake up the local ecosystem and actors. And obviously, it's a very useful data point and analysis when you go to funders to make the case. So it helps you get the cost of inaction. And then the third is, I think, coming up with the socio-economic ROI of the investments that can be made. So I think this whole climate science-driven analytics, and we have a tool that we call Climate Impact AI. There are many other approaches. I think really is a very important starting point for this discussion. Then, of course, you can come up with a list of actions. I think the next key step is then to prioritize them, working closely with the city and the communities in the city, because you can, again, analysis can take you to a certain extent. And if I may use the consulting cliche of we do these 2x2s of, on the one axis, you can have the level of vulnerability which the science gives you, and the other is more the feasibility, which really has to come from talking to local stakeholders, city government, community, etc. And then you try to identify the projects which fall on the high quadrant of both, which is highly vulnerable, as well as where there's momentum among city stakeholders to do something. And they use that to prioritize what are the big ticket investments that you should go after. And then lastly, I think there's no point stopping there. The real rubber hits the road is where investment mobilization. We are doing that right now in a number of places. And to be honest, that's the hardest part. I think there are enough tools to do the analysis. There are good frameworks to do prioritization. But really going into investment mobilization is tough. You need to have a very good sense of what exactly you're trying to seek funding for, to the level of investment memos which go into a lot of detail. Each project will have a very different capital stack. You'll have to approach different funders, right? So a landfill project will be very different from an early warning system, will be very different from rainwater harvesting, will be very different from disease surveillance. And you need to figure out the magic combination. Blended finance is a big topic in this COP, but making the magic of blended finance happen at the project level is what is really, really hard. And I think you have to sort of take a very, very detail-oriented approach to get there. So let me just stop there with this, but this is sort of an approach that we have followed now with a bunch of cities and sub-national regions, which seems to be getting somewhere. And I'd love to hear views of the others on especially the investment mobilization bit, which I think is where the rubber hits the road.
Thank you, Varad. And I think on the investment mobilization, I'll move on to Giampiero. Maybe you can we skip a little bit so we focus on the topic at hand. Maybe you can share some of the experiences you had on your Green Cities program. We know that EBRD has been pioneering a large-scale program for green cities, and you're really indeed addressing there on the need for the municipalities to come up with the action plans and then help them to mobilize the resources in addition to what the EBRD financing. So any lessons learned and experience that you can address? Question from Marat immediately. Thanks, Giampiero.
Thank you, Julia, and really a pleasure to be here. And good morning. It's good morning, afternoon already to everybody. So Atika talked about the continuum, and actually everything was said before really resonate with me, with us. There is a lot of experience that I think we share. Maybe before I go to the BRD, let me highlight a few points that I think are important in this conversation, because I agree, with your analysis about the data is there. I may argue that granular data is not necessarily available everywhere, so there is still a process of improving the But where we see, this is our experience, the issues with cities, is what is still missing, going back to the capacity building point that Amit made before. It's the capacity to process this information and then come with long-term planning, identification of priority interventions, and also understanding where the policy roadblocks are and how they can be turned into enablers. And this is something that in some cities is a chronic issue. It's about really capacity, people, expertise, and that gap is absolutely fundamental to address, because otherwise you cannot really introduce long-term interventions. And in a way, that's going back to the BRD, that's what we are trying to do. We have a Green City program that has been established for quite some time. 2 weeks ago, we replenished the framework, adding an extra 3 billion euro to support the next phase. It covers around 50 cities across the BRD region, from a relatively small city, Alba Iulia in Romania, for example, to very large city like Istanbul or Cairo. And the fundamental idea around the program, it revolves around what we call, with no much sort of creativity, Green City Action Plan, which is basically a process in the first place. It's about engaging with all the city actors, the city authorities, the civil society groups, the business community, the financial community. It includes 3 elements. It's about diagnostics, so there is an element of acquiring information and trying to review, benchmark the performance of the city across multiple metrics, from urban transport to space heating to waste management, to the water system, etc. And this diagnostic is very fundamental. It's a bottom-up approach because really reflect the inputs from the community, from the users, and also, of course, from the operators. But ultimately, the main result of this is 2 products. One is the identification of the policy priorities that needs to be addressed, and crucially, an investment pipeline. And this is what, of course, as EBRD we're interested, because of course we provide finance, but ultimately, it gives a very strong signal, not only to the local communities, but very much to the investors and the financiers, because it gives an indication about the direction of travel that the city wants to pursue. But the main value of all of this is really the awareness raising. It's really creating a consensus. There is a lot of talks about social contract, even at this COP. So it creates the consensus among the different stakeholders about what matters and what the priorities for the city. And on top of that, of course, also create, you talk about magics, magical outcomes. I give you one example that is relatively recent. So one of our green cities is Chisinau, which is the capital city of Moldova. It's a country, middle-income countries, but at the lower range of middle-income countries. With if you follow the geopolitics, is a very a country with exposure to Russian influence, trying to get closer to the EU. So it's a vulnerable country in many ways. But anyway, as a part of the process and the engagement, completely transformed the way they looked at risk of flooding. So there is a river crossing the city, River Beck. So the original solution was the typical conventional solutions to try to control the river with cement infrastructure, the usual approach. But ultimately, through this analysis, we did indeed a socio-economic analysis that included a number of different elements, and ultimately they changed their mind, and ultimately it's going to be a nature-based solution. So it's going to be a combination of planting certain areas, reshaping the river banks with green solutions, and this is going to be the first example of nature-based solution for flooding protection in the city, with a lot of multiple co-benefits, because creates green space, creates cooling effects in the neighboring areas. And this is the last point I would like to make. What I see, which is increasingly important in the conversation about priorities and what are the interventions needed, is trying to look at the co-benefits. So when you introduce a adaptation measure, not only you reduce the risk associated to a natural event, but ultimately you reduce the cost of reconstruction. You ultimately improve the way, the competitiveness of the local economy. So you actually give a signal also to the investor that actually this is a city that ultimately is worth investing because they're taking adaptation seriously. And maybe last point, and I close. What I also see is a convergence among different agendas, which is very interesting again, because going back to the socioeconomic analysis, reinforce the case for adaptation to be seen as an investment and not as a cost. And the convergence is about dealing with physical climate risk, geophysical risk. I was last week in Montenegro. There was the UNDRR regional platform discussion. Ultimately, it was extremely interesting because the agendas are converging. And when we talk about devastating effects of the earthquake in Turkey, for example, right, and the reconstruction process. Well, now the climate agenda, the geophysical risk agenda is coming together with green characteristics, green principle of rebuilding the building stock affected by the earthquake. So when you combine these things, ultimately you see that there is a positive economic return. It's not only reducing the risk for the population. And this kind of convergence is very common in the cities. Maybe last point, in our Green City program, we also have something which is called Green City Officers Network. Right? There are a lot of networks and clubs and alliances at the city level. So we didn't want to replicate what is already existing. So we ultimately targeted the middle level managers, the people that don't take decisions, actually influence decisions at the city level. And we bring them together once or twice a year. Well, more often than not, when we bring them together, we do presentation, we talk about what they can do, we bring speakers. But you know what? The best moments is when we are out of the room and they speak to each other, they share experience, and that has a tremendous effect in accelerating, the deployment of best practice.
Thank you so much, Giampiero, and thank you for highlighting the example on the nature-based solutions. I think more and more we indeed see those municipalities and other financiers of infrastructure to evaluate the possibility of alternatives and considering nature-based solutions, understanding that not only does it support maybe perhaps as a better option to improve flooding, for example, but it's also a cost-effective solution. So thank you for highlighting this example there. Now, Eddie, I'll come over to you. Sorry, I skipped the line. I wanted to address the financing bit here, but indeed, Giampiero touched upon on the policy roadblocks and the need for specific diagnostics. So perhaps you could share what GCA is doing in this regard. We know this is an organization that is providing a lot of support to developing countries in accelerating adaptation action, and you indeed have a lot of experience in understanding what are the specific policy roadblocks experienced by the developing countries. Maybe you could shed some light on the examples that GCA does in this regard.
Thank you so much, and thank you to AIB for the invitation on this panel. Great to be with all of you, and thank you for joining us today. A couple of words on the Global Center on Adaptation. It's an international organization set up that emerged after the Global Commission on Adaptation, co-chaired by Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, to come and make the economic case for adaptation. And the Global Center on Adaptation does three things. One is high-level advocacy with heads of state to get the heads of state talking about adaptation, because that's when it trickles down and they're not talking only about climate in general, but specifically about climate adaptation. Second is working with the larger financiers to bring adaptation to their investment programs in their design. So together with the African Development Bank and the African Union, GCA designed what is the largest adaptation program in the world, $25 billion of investments over 5 years. After 3.5 years, 10 billion have been invested in Africa with full mainstreaming on the adaptation perspective. And third is a lot of the knowledge and capacity building in this direction. But I want to then frame my groupings of examples on what Amit was saying on the topics of innovation, policy governance, and capacity building. So a few examples of innovation with a sense that part of what GCA tries to do is not to develop the innovation and then look for financing, but tag along the IFIs as they prepare the projects to be able to make sure that during project preparation, the best science and policy and practice of adaptation gets inserted in that direction. So, for example, in several programs in Africa, and at least 12 different cities in Africa, we have come, everybody says nature-based solutions. But nature-based solutions are really complicated. Remember that nature-based solutions need land, and land is really expensive and difficult to obtain in Africa. Second, nature-based solutions take time to grow and achieve the full benefits, while gray solutions, you can build and you get the adaptation benefit right away. But they are much cheaper and easier to sustain, but you need to have a mechanism to sustain that process. So all of that question, moving away from the romantic view, nature-based solutions are beautiful, they can save the world, is really the hard analysis of what is the right combination of gray and green infrastructure, what is feasible in terms of land and communities, who is going to be maintaining that nature-based solution in the longer term so that it doesn't deteriorate and maintains a resilient process. So that's one area that has grown really well. Second, areas as simple as gender. Many people talk about gender, but how do you actually start mainstreaming in difficult contexts like Chad, in urban resilient programs of the World Bank, the gender climate vulnerability that influences investments immediately, that comes and have a direct impact right away in that process. So that's the kind of innovations that we're trying to bring to the portfolio design of these institutions. Now, we work with the African Development Bank, the World Bank, IFD. It's been a great collaboration. We also work with the IMF. So the IMF has the Resilient and Sustainability Program. Okay? And so the IMF came and said, look, we know a lot about macroeconomics, institutions, budgets, all the things. We don't know adaptation. And we hear all of these clients that they are having a really important fiscal impact, the climate disasters that are taking place. So we work with the IMF teams to help them design the adaptation policy measures that are part of the resilience and sustainability package in that process. So, for example, in Senegal, out of the 350 million RST program, then the policy matrix includes a very specific line item in terms of the upgrading of the design, construction, and supervision for urban environments as part of policy reform. And you would never think that the IMF would get into this process, but as they look backwards, the impacts, the fiscal impacts that the Ministry of Finance needs to have by signing the checks and reconstructing all this housing in that process, not even counting the social impact, is just tremendous and raised to the top of the priorities that they wanted to do. So policy and governance in that sense. And then on capacity building, a really interesting program where we are saying LLA. We are all signed up to LLA, but doing LLA is really difficult because you really need to get the city to devolve a lot of the power to communities to begin to say, this is what we need on adaptation. And we have worked with the Asian Development Bank in Bangladesh, 60 municipalities developing what they call the People's Adaptations Plan. Sounds very patriotic, but actually it is really the local, low-income sections of the city beginning themselves to planning and say, this is where our blockages are, this is where most of the flooding are happening, this is what we need to do in that process. And that methodology has now been incorporated by the Ministry of Local Government and is being rolled out and trained in 600 municipalities, and we're helping in that process based on the practical examples of an investment program in the ADB. So what at the core, what is happening is that you have this, the IFIs and the big financiers interested in adaptation, but remember that you have a transport expert or an urban expert or a solid waste expert, and finding what is the best practice on adaptation, who are the best consultants that can know and come, how to mobilize the funding for that, and GCA supports in all of that package to be able to help that. And we signed with AIB on Wednesday our letter of intent to really also work in Bangladesh and in Africa, which are our first areas of engagement, to really do the same kind of thing. How do you actually help to make sure that those investments are really climate proof with the best science and policy and the deep technical expertise in that direction. We conclude with a little bit of the analytics in that process, because I think that becomes really important. We have an annual report on the state and trends in climate adaptation, and we started 5 years ago. First one global, 2 deep dives in Africa. Last year was in finance, and this year is on small island development states. And it's really all of that question of how do you bring the best data and science and analysis, and then you connect that to all the way from macroeconomics, finance, trade, debt, sectoral issues and cross-sectoral questions, to be able to say what are the critical priorities in countries like the small islands, to say what do you do on adaptation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. Again, very, very interesting and a large sweep of actions that the GCA is doing. And I think every single panelist have touched based on the need for diagnostic, understanding the local context, and specifically deep dive into what would be the best adaptation actions in this space. So maybe we want to back to you, Varad. After hearing what the other panelists have said, and I think you've also highlighted how you need to look at the complexity of the issue and advising the governments and understanding what would be the key priority actions to do that. What is the one thing that you think is critical to move that needle and help the cities to actually build the resilience to climate change?
I'm always wary of the silver bullet questions, because there's no one silver bullet ever. But since you're forcing me, I will say figuring out how to engage the private sector, because we all know the reality of both national fiscal and local fiscal. We also know, of course, there's large commitment of DFIs and MDBs, but that's never going to be sufficient to meet the funding gap that we will have. In any case, on infrastructure, and adapted infrastructure even more so. So how do we bring in the private sector? This magic word is floated around a lot now, PPPP, public-private philanthropic partnership, which is also one of these like locally led adaptation, a very nice word, but very hard to do. And I think just from reflecting on our experience, I would say 3 or 4 learnings on that point. One is you have to speak the language of the private sector. When you take plans or projects for discussion, it has to be in a format that it speaks to them, right? And often it means having investment memos in a very private sector format, which means having very good clarity on rigorous estimates of IRRs, questions, clear answers on questions like who is the counterparty, what is their bankability, what are the revenue streams, what are the risks associated with those revenue streams, are there any guarantees in place, what is the commitment of the local government to this, in what way are they going to come in. So, all of these questions which any private investor would ask for any project, we need to be able to answer for our adaptation projects if you want serious amounts of private capital to flow. And then I think you have to be quite innovative on the capital stack. It cannot, every project will require a different combination of debt and equity. It will require different ideas around junior tranches of concessional capital or guarantees, or even like technical assistance, project preparation, support, all the elements of blended finance that we talk about. Last year, you had done a lot of work, Julia, on the different instruments that we are seeing, new and innovative instruments and adaptation. We need to bring that whole toolkit into play to actually galvanize the private sector. And then lastly, I would say bring them in very early. Don't take, like I think you mentioned, don't take cooked projects to the private sector, because it will never be something off the menu that they can buy. It'll have to be co-created. These projects are extremely complex, and it is through an iterative creation of the capital stack is how you will get real private sector action and mobilization. So I think that's really in my mind, the single biggest priority. Unlock private sector capital. It requires a lot of detail orientation, understanding and speaking the language of the private sector, and bringing them in early.
Thanks. Very timely, and indeed, maybe we can dwell on this issue a little bit longer as well. Attica, do you agree that it's really the private sector that is very important, and is AFD doing anything with the private sector to help the cities address the resilience challenge?
Thank you for the question. And actually, it was the direction I was going to on how to mobilize more capital. So thank you very much. But maybe before, I'll take a step back and say how we believe that are the steps that the cities have to take to better planning for resilience, and how then to mobilize financing, being public, private, and any kind of source. There is, of course, the what an IFI will say on a project level, but there is a vulnerability mapping, a risk mapping to be done, and here we can support our partners in doing so. And I totally agree in the fact that as much as possible, if sometimes grey investments are needed and sometimes nature-based solutions are the most relevant, that's where a good and holistic planning would help. And I'm coming from the water sector initially, and this is something that I've seen that sometimes is forgotten, is we are looking only at the CapEx and not the OpEx. And that's really important when we're doing the planning, to look not only at the first investment initially, but what are the investments that are the most relevant also on the long run in terms of operation and maintenance, because the budget stability or the budget robustness of a city is really important. And this is challenging in a lot of the geographies where we are working. And that brings me to the other aspect that I didn't describe initially. On top of doing a climate screening at the project level to look at the vulnerability of the project to climate change, we are doing also, when we are considering non-sovereign financing to cities, we are doing also a due diligence, including an assessment of the exposure of the cities to climate financial risks before offering the loan to them. So being physical, obviously, but also transition risks to every single city. And as part of our mandate, we are updating every year this assessment of the cities and exposure to climate risks, because it can change, especially like transition risks can change really quickly if the good planning is put in place. And then when we have a good knowledge of both the environment but also the actor, we can propose a classical financing, public finance to finance infrastructure. We can also provide finance for the transformation of the actor. That's something that is really important in our new strategy that is going to be approved soon. It's the fact that we are not only looking at projects, but as much as possible, we are trying also to support our partners in their trajectory towards Paris alignment, towards Cumming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework alignment. So we are helping the transformation of the actor. We do that with financial institutions, and we will do that also with cities in order to have a better integration at the policy level, which has a more systemic impact than just working on a single project. We are working then at the municipality level, which then has which is triggering effect on the whole investment of the cities. And then in terms of tools on top of the classical public finance and the two kinds that I described, what we can do at the local level is actually mobilizing the local environment. So the public development banks, namely, as a leverage to mobilize even more financing for the cities. So I'd like here to mention two projects that could be good examples. The first one is CityRees. It's actually a guarantee with support of the EU that we are offering in African cities, for African cities. The guarantee is provided to National Development Bank, being public, being commercial, that will then offer a better condition to the cities as long as it's to offer financing for sustainable cities with high in the agenda, both mitigation and adaptation. So when I say better condition, it's lowering interest rates, it's providing higher maturities. So when we're talking investments and some infrastructure, it's really important to talk also about the maturity. But also some capacity building for the cities in order to ensure the quality and the success of the project. I'd like also to mention, as you know, AFD is part of IDFC, which is a club of 27 public development banks. And as part of IDFC, there is a project that's actually managed by my colleague here called the NUCA, New Urban Communities Activities, to help cities in better integrating, to help public development banks in 5 countries to promote a pipeline of projects that either help in reducing, in mitigation, but also in increasing adaptation. And why it is important in this project, it's a strong technical assistance that is supported by IKI, German government, where we have to build the capacities of the national financial systems in order to be able to have offers, financial offers for the cities, dedicated to the cities and dedicated to sustainable cities. Because sometimes the banks, there is an opportunity and we are convinced of that, but there is just this gap of knowledge or this lack of capacity building for the national development banks to provide this kind of support. So this project is in Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, South Africa, and Mozambique. We are helping the national development banks of this country to have the capacities to provide tailor-made offer to the cities for sustainable development.
Thank you. You've mentioned several things that I think are also critical and that have not been touched previously by the panel, which is on the different financial products that are available and the need to actually address not only CapEx but OpEx as well. And with that, I'm turning into Veronica, and maybe if you can speak a little bit on the insurance product and the insurance industry, and what can Swiss Re do to help actually municipalities with the insurance products to address the need to build the resilience?
Thank you, and I hope you're recording this session because I look forward to taking all the hints that the panelists have offered. There is a plethora of amazing insights. Thank you all. So maybe I'll use 2 leading words for my point. One is just listening to the conversation. What the private sector needs is confidence and price signal. And you get the stronger the pricing signal, the more confidence you build, right? So I think Giampiero was starting us off in that direction. So let me say how I'm trying to go from a single product approach to something that is a little bit more scalable and systematic. We've been collaborating with the ISO. You all know maybe the 3 standards that they've come out with, 14,000, 90, 91, 92. And everything we do is connecting to those standards to make sure that we are using a common reference. And those standards are used for us in our risk engineering as we assess projects. And we can also assess whether those projects are actually being built to those standards or not. Because let's not forget, and I think Vadim was going there is a level of capacity to adopt the standards is not enough to issue them. To create a strong price signal, you may recall, Julia, last year, I mentioned we've come out with this analysis because projects and interventions for adaptation can be extremely diverse, as we heard throughout the panel, but we need a common, I call it a normalization curve, a way to compare apples and pears. And so the simplest thing that we could do for ourselves is what we call the benefit to cost ratio, which looks at the expected benefit and cost reduction of making certain interventions. Last year we created this approach and compared across independently verified interventions across flood and heat. Actually, it was our portfolio. This year we doubled down on flood. And what we've found, which I think is a very important price signal element, especially for cities, 58% of the cities globally are affected by floods. So it's a very, very important phenomenon for cities themselves. And we know that with the right interventions, and in the document we detail which one those are, one can reduce the cost of flooding by 98% for coastal interventions, some gray, some green and gray integrated infrastructure, and 75% in the case of river, adaptation. So it's a massive value, because today we're already spending 52 billions in flood-related losses. So imagine how much of that money that goes into recovery and reconstruction, if it went just in a fraction of 1 to 10, went into those adaptation measures that we know are really, really effective. Our studies show are really, really effective. So that's one item I wanted to leave this audience with. And in the context of integrating the at scale nature into our adaptation intervention, especially for infrastructure, I want to build on what was said before about this need to integrate and the difficulty that there is with local communities. So we've been working now for 3 years to use nature as an adaptive measure. And I'm very optimistic, because 3 years have meant that we now have, for instance, in Indonesia, natural assets are recognized as a result of a legislative and policy intervention as a capital asset in equal standing to other public assets. It took a little bit of time, but with that we have a nature registry. Because you have a nature registry, then you can do the CAPEX and the OPEX analysis. You can look, what does it take to maintain and restore this asset? And so we've been working now with the ADB on 4 countries, Indonesia is one of them, Philippines, Solomon Islands, Fiji, to develop economically justified, socially integrated measures for risk reduction and adaptive interventions for those communities. Again, it takes time, but having done it now for countries, I'm confident we can take it to another 30 countries around the world, because we have that, and that is done in collaboration with conservation agencies, it's done in collaboration with local communities, with their understanding, with their support. So it takes a bit of work, but it's a way of operating that it becomes scalable, generalizable to other markets. My final thought is on heat, because Amit left us with an invitation to think about heat. So, and on heat, I want to say 3 things. We've taken the first heat cover to market, actually for women in the informal sector, in urban settings and in rural settings, this April. To support them, because heat can be a deadly killer and a huge impact on productivity for people that work outdoor. On the back of that experience in India, and we're doing it privately through the Self-Employed Women Association, we're moving from 50,000 members to 500,000 members this year. The idea is to cover 3 million members by the end of 2027. But we're taking that experience to Africa, to Thailand. We're using it in the actually very well-developed economies of US and Australia, and I'll maybe double down there because it's interesting. In the case of the US, it's actually not just about heat community, city community protection, but also energy infrastructure. And that goes into the OPEX discussion, because they're there, but they're not resilient to shock. And so yield and production and cost of energy and availability of energy is heavily affected. And in the case of Australia, we actually taking it even one step further. It's actually the Greater Sydney Heat Coalition, where the government has asked us to work together with the real economy to develop a set of interventions where the materials that are used are going to be climate resilient, new products that have low carbon footprint, informing policies and therefore informing also procurements for new infrastructure that will be built for all public assets to come, with insurance products that have to have a signal, a price signal that says, if you're building this way, if you're constructing with this material, the cost of insurance will come down, because we know that that has implicit resiliency value in it. We know that we can do it because we've looked back when, in the case of the city of Roma was flooded in Australia in 2012, the interventions that were made meant 34% reduction in the cost of insurance for residential purposes. We know we can do it because that's what we do in the UK with Building Back Better, where we're helping build after an event to higher standards. And we know that that's what happened with Ian and earthquakes in Japan. You can have a 60% reduction in losses by building to a higher standard. So I hope we can go towards a more integrative approach. And from an insurance sector standpoint, we clearly want to be part of the signal community, giving a strong incentive that prices can be reduced, if not just kept stable from an insurance market, if we do this in a joined up form.
Wonderful. Indeed, so interesting of all of the facts that you shared with us today and on the different initiatives that the Swiss Re is working together with countries. And something like a nature registry, I hope, will be picked up by a number of governments as we're all trying to address this nexus around the nature and the climate and the benefit that it has to the society and to the cities as well. So one last question to Giampiero. Given we are running out of time, and I think this has been an extremely rich discussion today. So several of the panelists have spoken about the private sector, and I think Veronica shared on what the insurance role is with helping in cities. What do you think is lacking for the private sector to be more and more supportive on the actions with the municipalities to work together? And are there any PPP structures that would work more or less? And how can we kind of make this coherence together between the private sector working with municipalities to build the resilience?
Thank you for the question. It's not an easy one to address. I think Varad mentioned already gave a bit of a menu of things to do, and indeed Veronica highlighted the importance of information and data to support, and the capacity building indeed, to support investment decision. I like maybe to highlight 2 points. One is, and based on all of these, in fact, there are 2 ways to involve the private sector. Well, actually, multiple ways, right? But I'd like to touch upon 2 elements. One is the capital market, right? So cities, at least in the region where we operate, are only now timidly looking at capital market instruments, and ultimately that offers a lot of opportunities. We have a direct experience in the BRD. I think we've been the first MDB, to issue climate resilience bonds out of our portfolio of investments. And ultimately, what that sort of activity showed us is, even for an organization like the BRD, ultimately, improved our investor base. There are a number of investors in our capital market products that were not interested in, EBRD exposure, but ultimately, they become interested because we offer the different products. And there are investors out there that are quite keen to look into resilience-focused instruments. So this is something we're trying to do with a number of cities. Is providing the capacity, the institutional capacity, to look at capital market, issue green bonds, and in time we would like them to also expand their set of products and include products like more focused products like climate resilience bonds. There is a new standard that has been relatively recently introduced by the Climate Bond Initiative that can offer a good template. And again, our experience, and it's not only the BRD experience in the market, that there are a lot of investors out there that are interested in this type of product. So that's one potential avenue. You mentioned PPPs. PPPs are interesting and good, but also they come with significant transaction cost. And let's say that sometimes is part of a problem. One area I would like to touch is procurement. I think, Veronica, you mentioned procurement. Public procurement is an area which I think is still not completely explored and deployed. So that's an area where cities can involve, also integrate a bit more, the private sector. So, and this can be done more at the institutional level, through standards and policies and criteria, but can also be done in a very commercially focused manner. And I'll give you one example about what we do at EBRD, which is not necessarily targeted to cities, but ultimately can be utilized at the city level. We have developed a few years ago, actually it's been around for quite some time now, what we call Green Technology Selector, right? What it is, it's a long list, thousands and thousands of technologies, green technologies, that are screened and are assessed in terms of their performance criteria. So it's mitigation technologies, adaptation technologies, technologies that deliver nature-related outcomes, They are country-specific, and they cover many elements, including buildings, for example. So it's energy efficient technologies for buildings, interventions for reducing water consumption in buildings. These are, is an ongoing open database of technologies. We have a consultant that review applications from different technology providers. Again, they screen the technology, filter them out according to, again, performance criteria. And ultimately, this is already start to be adopted by city in the sense that, let's say, it offers a very practical tool to identify those technologies that actually deliver an environmental or a climate outcome, and can be also facilitate transaction costs in terms of financing. So again, this combination of looking at more institutional procurement practices, but also using tools that the market can offer that can accelerate the connection between the technology provider, the service providers, and city level investments, I think can be a way to attract more private capital towards cities.
Thank you very much, Giampiero. We have very little time left, so I do want to give some space for the audience for any burning questions. Perhaps one or two questions we could reach out to any of the panelists. If you could please introduce yourself and address a specific question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for all these this amazing discussion. It's been great. My name is Anna. I work at ISO, actually. Thank you so much, Veronica. You saved me a lot of time for the introduction. Perhaps just to add that the standards that we develop with ISO and our members are developed in a very consultative way. From the national level, inputs are collected from different stakeholders of different sectors, of all the sectors, and they're brought, these inputs, to the international technical committees that develop the standards. So it's a very participatory process, and 2/3 of our membership are developing countries, so it's quite representative of that. I just wanted to ask, and following on your comment on these standards, like standards for climate adaptation, environmental management in general, are you using these standards? And it's a question maybe to all of you. And if you're using these standards, how do you find that useful, or do you think that there's anything else that ISO can do to make these standards maybe people more aware of these standards, and what is missing, for these standards to really to be used across all the different sectors to ensure that, those investments are less risky, more impactful? So maybe I'll leave it.
Thank you. Perhaps one more question from the audience. If not, maybe I turn back to the panelists, and maybe if each one of you can say something about the standards.
Yeah, I can very briefly address. For sure we're using ISO standards in the way we structure projects, in the way we suggest implementation. So perhaps what I observe, and by the way, sorry, I'm also absolutely convinced that we need more standards out there, because it facilitates, on green products, on green services, on green criteria for construction, for example, because that also helps a lot reducing the transaction cost when it comes to determining what represents climate finance, what represents green finance. So think about, for example, supply chain financing, right? We are very keen, we are looking now at products that tag a material across the value chain, and we would like to do it, by applying standards, and that's something that, in our view, can really be an accelerator. Maybe what I observed in certain countries, the awareness is not necessarily there, and perhaps that's an area where we can think about. I would say it's not the awareness about the value of it. I would say it's a bit missing, and that's where I think there is a need maybe to do some. Going again to the capacity building piece, right? But definitely we use it, very regularly.
2 points. I think that ISO has begun the journey on adaptation and resilience. That's a little bit like 10 years behind mitigation and green products in that process. So strong encouragement to accelerate that journey. Second, and this has important influence because when we talk here private sector, I hear the same biases, which is private sector for resilient infrastructure. But one has to zoom out and know that actually the role of the private sector in adaptation and resilience is much wider. Because a community, a nation, a city is not going to be resilient unless you have a vibrant ecosystem of enterprises that provide resilient services and products. And in a way, it's the same barrier that we had 20 years ago with energy efficiency. At the beginning, energy efficiency, look, nobody knew. Even if you knew that it was important, you didn't know who to call to help you as an industry to deal with your energy efficiency. The banks wouldn't lend you if you were an energy efficiency service company. So we are at the same juncture where adaptation is still not there on the private sector side, and I think that you were precisely saying those issues. So you need that. So in GCA, for example, we're doing adaptation entrepreneurs competitions, and you find these amazing ideas of people that are coming with adaptation products that you would never think in that process. So that needs to become part of the norm of expanding, and the standards are going to be an important part of the process so that we don't do only green value chains, but resilient value chains in that direction. Finally, I think that and this becomes really important because you not only want to have your city resilient, but it is the city services that are resilient, and it is the population that has enough resilience, even when those services fail, what to do in that process. And therefore, thinking it through in a more comprehensive way at the city level, because in the end, adaptation and resilience is everybody's business. How do you do that process in that direction? And therefore, standards that help, because you have very good ones on operation and maintenance standard, how to think in industries and the like, and therefore thinking it through. How do you actually think standards to make those standard operating procedures for services that become more resilient and start upgrading that, and in a way mainstreaming adaptation and resilience into all of your standards, so that they become the normal way of doing now that you have so many climate shocks, would be a fantastic way to move forward.
I think a lot has been said on standards, and I think I'll just make a broader point on standardization, which is that I think we all saw today that there are lots of good examples already, and everybody shared on how adaptation is being prioritized in cities. I think standardization of various things will really help. Standardization of how you do community engagement, standardization of how you'll do local capacity building. You know, I'm sure you're building some tools and modules on that. Standardization of solutions which can be easily used. And lastly, of course, the standardization of financing. Are there clear models, archetypes of models we can create which are standardized? So I think we all recognize good stuff is happening in this front, but we need much more speed and scale, and that will come through standardization across all these dimensions.
Thank you. I'll try to go fast. But as you were talking about standardization, I wanted to mention about all the work done under the Global Goal on Adaptation to define the right indicators and AFD. Someone in my team who is an adaptation expert is actually part of the Poverty and Livelihood Working Group, as there are these indicators that are described on the way to COP30, and we should not forget that. I think it will give also some framework for our activities in the coming future, even though like adaptation is really depending on the local context and all that, but that's the difficulty of defining this set of indicators. I want to mention a small example of how it is not straightforward actually on the value chain. An example of that we had, and it was the starting point of why one of my colleagues, Damien, has been working on standards in the value chain. We have been displaying a credit line in Morocco that were targeting the improvement of the practices of industries. And for 2 years, it was not used at all. So we were talking with the bank, and then suddenly, in a span of a few months, everything was disbursed. So we talked with the bank asking, like, how come you had difficulties and now suddenly it was used? And why it was used is because the buyers of the industry, which are the big textile industry like Zara, Mango, and all that were buying from the factories in Morocco, they came back that's when the funds were used, and they said, look, we are committed to have, as part of a CSR, this kind of standards in terms of use of water. It was mainly use of water, so it resonates with the adaptation topic of today. So you need to have your factories that fit within these standards, because that's our requirement as a buyers of your products. And within a span of a few months, it was totally dispersed. So building on that experience, we are now working on other examples in the textile industry, and we know that it's not only about offering financing. It's also being sure that the demand is here. And the demand is here. We are working notably with ITC, for instance, to try to work with standards. And namely in Bangladesh, we are working on a project, because if the standards are here at the buyer's level, then it will have an impact on the whole value chain.
Yeah, I will just say, for me, adoption, and I think what we just heard is one of the biggest drivers of adoption. If there is a market demand, and that money counts. So I would just say supporting in every and each possible ways adoption of the standards will make a huge difference.
Thank you. I see one more question from the audience, and then I will ask to close it. Maybe we can have a microphone passed?
Thank you. My name is Shravanti. I'm from India. I'm an urban planner and a sustainability professional. Thank you for the wonderful discussion. It's not a question, but just a point that on ISO standards, standardizing some of the topics that we spoke about perhaps will also help in successfully implementing Article 6 across countries. Standardizing the infrastructure solutions. It's just a point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to thank the esteemed panelists for such a wonderful and rich discussion. I think we did touch about all of the things that Mr. Proti has asked us to do, which is innovation and capacity building and governance. And we did hear a lot of interesting solutions with regards to tailored products, tools, and the standards and all of the other actions that each of these organizations are doing to support cities in building more resilience. So I thank you so much again for the panelists for coming here today. And we did record this session, so those who are interested, please come back and listen to it. And then if I can ask to take a photograph with the panelists, thank you so much.